Hello and welcome to this special event of the European AI Forum. My name is Daniel Abu. I'm from the German AI Association, as you can see in this lovely banner beneath me, and I welcome you all over Europe. And today I'm not alone, thankfully, because I have my dear colleague Millie Dulan from Crow AI. Hello Zagreb, dober dan. I hope you are very fine. Hello Millie.
Hi, Daniel, and hi, everyone else. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you. All over Europe. So, bonjour, guten Tag, guten Mittag, and many other languages I can speak. We are really happy to be here. As you see that I'm from the German Association, Millie is from Crow AI, the Croatian Association, and we are under the umbrella of the European AI Forum. And Millie, perhaps you want to talk a little bit about the European AI Forum, please?
Absolutely. So for those of you who don't know us, the European AI Forum was launched in June 2020 on the final day of the Croatian presidency over the Council of the EU. And we initially planned it as a conference that takes place at the end of each council presidency. But in the meantime, it has grown into a network of associations that want to make sure startups and innovators from member states have a voice when it comes to AI in Brussels. The forum was founded by Crow AI, France IA, and KI Bundesverband, but we are very happy that our community now includes AI associations from Austria, Bulgaria, Slovenia, Sweden, and the Netherlands, and we are always looking forward to expanding our family. But basically, our main goal is to serve as a platform where entrepreneurs and policymakers get together to jointly determine the path forward for European AI innovation.
Yeah, thank you, Millie. It's our little European AI family. We founded just not so long ago, and we are very happy that it expands. But if you are from a country which is not participating and you have direct contact to your national AI association, hit us up and we'll get in contact with them. But it's not about us today. It is about a very important thing that you all tuned in today. It is about the AI regulation in the European Union. And we are very, very proud to say hello to our guest of honor, Mr. Killian Gross from the European Commission. Hello, Mr. Gross, nice to see you. So, and then is he frozen? Mr. Gross, hello. Can you hear me? That is one of the main sentences of 2020.
No. Yes, I can hear you. It's all fine. I can hear and see you, Millie and Daniel. It's all great.
Thank you so much for being here and answering our question. We leave the floor to you. After that, we have some pre-recorded video questions, but to all the audience, to all who are watching now, you have the live chat in YouTube. Millie is so kind of giving your question the attention it needed, and we will pose these questions, I guess not all, but we tried most of them, of course, as they come in. And Mr. Gross, I think you have a presentation for all of us. And after that, we go to the questions, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you, Millie, for this very warm welcome. I will try to summarize a little bit our work from the last year and to give you an overview about this proposal, because it's not yet a law. It's a proposal for a regulation which will now be sent to the European Parliament and the the Council of Ministers, and then, of course, our co-legislators have to negotiate it and may finally adopt it. But I think it's of great interest to you, and I know that we had already previous exchanges, and I'm very much looking forward to have an exchange today with those people who will be really concerned by this legislation, because you are representing the companies, the business, the entrepreneurs, the startups who are really doing AI, developing it and bringing it to our societies and to our economy. So thanks a lot for this opportunity. I'm looking forward to your questions, and I will try to do my best to answer them as clearly as I can. I will now show you a little presentation, just because I think it's perhaps easier to visualize a little bit how this this could work. I see now, you should now be able to see my screen, I hope. Can you see my screen, Daniel? Daniel, Millie, can you
Not
see
at
the
the
screen?
moment. We are just, wait a second. Wait a sec. We are just checking it out. I'm not seeing it at the moment, but this is also not unusual for 2021. So perhaps you can try again, or of course, what I can do is share your screen, and then we can check if to do that. Wait, I will share the screen here. Wait a second. This is not unusual for this thing. So wait, please. So we are here, presentation mode, trying to. So I present, and then we should do it like this, and like this, and like this.
Just let me know when you can see it.
Yes, and now we're seeing your presentation, and just tell me if I should switch then to the next one.
Okay, then let's switch to the next slide. Because I would, so let's go to the next one. Because I would like to explain a little bit first the package, what we have adopted last week. We had a chapeau communication, as we call it in the Brussels jargon, which mainly means that we had a communication where we put a bit the whole thing into the context, and we had two key deliverables. One was a coordinated plan, I will come to this at the end, and the other one was the regulatory framework. I think for you, the coordinated plan is very important. That's why I wanted to mention it, because it's our strategy how to trigger 20 billion of private and public investments in AI every year during this decade, because we think AI is a key technology for our society and for our economy, and there's a lot of benefits. And we don't want to come out with this message, AI is dangerous, or AI is tricky, or AI should be better only be checked or restricted. On the contrary, we think AI is a great technology and can bring a lot of benefits. That's why we try to illustrate here on the left-hand side with autonomous cars, the energy transformation, health, COVID has shown this, predictive maintenance, and so on. So there's a lot of things we can do with AI, and we should do with AI. That's why we have a strategy with about 40 actions, what we want to do in order to boost AI. At the same time, and this is, I think, in line with the traditional approach from the Commission to see these two things. At the same time, we think certain AI uses may cause risks. And we have seen this. We had a public consultation, which got a huge echo with more than 1,400 submissions. So we see there is a lot of concerns for fundamental rights and for safety. And these concerns we want to address, because we think that a good take-up of AI will require both a strong AI sector in Europe, but as well trust in this AI. So I can only summarize or repeat what our commissioner has said at the press conference. The key message we want to give is, if you want to do AI, come to Europe, because here you will get, you should get the right environment, and you should get the regulatory certainty which you will need to do business successfully. So the first, and of course, the center of my presentation will be the legal proposal. So we prepared a proposal for a regulation on AI. We are the first in the world to do that. So it was quite an adventure, an endeavor, what we tried. And we tried to do it in a balanced and in a modern way. So the first question we asked ourselves in this adventure was, do we really need a horizontal legislation on AI? Because we see other parts of the world, mainly the US, they're more going for, let's say, a sectorial approach. They're looking at biometrics, or they're looking at recruitment tools or public procurement tools, and they address these particular items. We nevertheless have chosen a little bit of a different approach here, because we think that AI displays certain features which may cause certain risks, which are the complexity, the opacity, the autonomy, the data dependency, and perhaps the difficulty to predict the outcome. And that doesn't need to, but that can, in certain use cases, lead to certain risks. And these risks may be safety risks, but there may be as well fundamental rights risks. And these risks we should address. And the last point on this problem definition here is we want to avoid fragmentation, because we see as well that our member states start to rethink about this and start to reflect how to address the potential problems of AI. And we think the last thing we really need would be 27 legislation. So we should have a proportionate, a balanced approach, but it should be a uniform approach. And that's why this is in an internal market legislation, after all, which should allow to create an internal market for AI to be freely used, sold, and deployed in Europe. After this first hurdle to think about, shall we go for a horizontal act, the second one was, of course, how we make this act future-proof. Because we are here dealing, and this is a challenge for a lawmaker, we are dealing with a very fast-moving target, because AI is developing, it's developing very, very quickly, and some people even say legislation is too slow to cover this kind of development. So, and this problem we already had, of course, when we looked at the definition of AI, because there's lots of definitions of AI out there, and you all know much better than me that AI in reality is a family of technologies. There's not this one AI, but there's a whole variety of techniques how you can achieve certain results. So what you see on the right-hand side, what we have then gone for to find a good solution is the OECD definition, which is a rather wide definition, but an internationally accepted definition. Because we want to be neutral, we want not to privilege or to disadvantage a certain technique and say this technique is AI, so just machine learning is AI, the other not AI, and to push developers into one direction. But we want to be as well future-proof because we don't know which technique will come out perhaps in a year or two. And at the same time, we want to be clear, because that's another thing which is very crucial for us, because what we heard from business throughout the whole preparatory process was, whatever you do, be clear, because the last thing we need is uncertainty, that we don't know what is allowed and what is not allowed and where are the boundaries. So what we did is we tried, on the basis of the definition on the right-hand side, on this OECD definition, we tried to put into Annex 1 some techniques which we think are clearly covered by this. So as a developer, you should look into Annex 1 of this future regulation, and this Annex 1 should then tell you whether the technique you're using is considered to be AI. And this Annex 1 can be adapted over time via a delegated act. That's a technique we use in Brussels, so to speed up legislation, so that the Commission is empowered to amend this list with some, of course, scrutiny reserves from Parliament and Council. And that would allow to keep this list up to date. And therefore, we think we can marry the two objectives, namely to be future-proof at the one hand side and to provide legal certainty on the other side. The third fundamental architectural element of our regulation is the risk-based approach, because we are convinced that most of the AI which is out there is not risky. I have to start with this. We believe, and that was clearly stated in the impact assessment, which is public since last Wednesday as well, we believe that 88 to 85% of the AI applications or users out there don't need any regulation. That should just be a place on the market, use, develop, whatever. They don't need restrictions. They're not more dangerous or more critical than any other software. But there are some which cause risks, and our job would be to identify which are those who really create risks and where it is justified to apply stricter criteria, requirements in order to make them safe. So if you look at what we created was a risk pyramid, and this is of course based on the work of our high-level group who did this for 2 years, and you can see there was a lot of thinking. The German Data Ethics Commission had as well this risk pyramid to be based on. We could, I think, build on a solid ground. We start by saying there's a lot of AI applications where there is minimal or no risk, predictive maintenance, spam control, no restriction, no regulation. And then there's this yellow layer where we believe there's not a lot of risk, but there is perhaps a need for more information so that the individual user knows what's happening. So that's the classical case of the bot. If you speak to a chatbot, that was something which came out again and again in the public consultation, the user would like to know that he or she is speaking to a bot and not to a human person. And there should be information. So that is all. There should not be a requirement on quality or accuracy. No, there should just be a requirement to inform the user. And then we come to the smaller group, because this pyramid is of course a bit disproportionate, because it looks like all the groups are of the same size, which is in our view not the case. In the high risk area, there we really have the critical users. And these critical users are not to be forbidden. No, they just should be carefully checked before they enter the market. And here we rely and we take inspiration from the classical product legislation, like for a car or for a plane. These systems should be made secure before they enter the market. Once they are on the market, they should be nearly plug and play. It should just be used, and the user should be able to rely on the tests which have been done before this system enters the market. So that's why we have a compliance check with requirements and an ex-ante conformity assessment for these systems. And then we have a very small, the top of the iceberg are those which provide an unacceptable risk. These are very few. These are listed in Article 5. There are 4 use cases which we have identified, and these we believe are so socially unacceptable that we don't need to make an assessment. That should just not happen. This will, for instance, be social scoring by public authorities. That is something we don't see in Europe. That is not compatible with our values, that the government starts to attribute social scores, points for certain behaviors and allocates benefits according to the scoring system. This is not what we want to see. So if you now start from the bottom and go to the top of this little mountain, and let me take you through this little tour. On the bottom, again, we find minimal or no risk. Here we have no obligations, but we allow member states to introduce codes of conduct, which are purely voluntary. And these codes of conduct are, if you wish, and if you follow the development, a bit of a replacement to the voluntary labeling, because we had in the beginning, we had the idea of a voluntary labeling, but that we gave up for a very simple reason, because we heard in the public consultation a lot of worries about this voluntary label, because a lot of companies felt that this would lead in practice to a peer pressure to apply the criteria which are appropriate for high level as well to low level. And it could lead to certain confusion, because for some applications, these requirements would be compulsory, for others, they would be voluntary, and that may, in the end, render it even more inaccessible or incomprehensible for the user than the system should be. So we gave that up, but nevertheless, we want to allow for voluntary codes of conduct if certain operators want to go beyond the legal obligations and they want to illustrate this. This is welcome. They could either cover AI systems which are of a lower risk category than our high risk category, or they could look at other requirements which we may not cover so well in our requirements. They could do something addition that we leave open, but of course it should not disturb the internal market. Then we have this category of certain risks, limited risks, the yellow one. And here we have 3 subgroups. I spoke already about one, that's the interacting with an AI system, the bot. But there are 2 others which I think are worth mentioning. One is the emotional recognition or biometric categorization system. Here we think the user should be informed. You should know when your emotions are analyzed by a biometric emotional recognition system. Because this would allow you to step out of such a system and not to use it. The same holds true for deepfakes. We think, in principle, these deepfakes should be indicated. It should be indicated that this image, this picture, has been created by a device and it's not representing a reality. This is, in our view, of course, this may be obvious from the context. There may be exceptions needed for artistic expressions, or for the freedom of expression, or even for police purposes. Sometimes you may need this. But in principle, that's why I say in principle, this should always go along with an information. These are the 3 categories of AI systems where we think that there should be, notwithstanding the fact that we don't consider them to be high risk, there should be this information requirement. And this can, of course, as well be combined with other requirements, because it may be that you use emotional recognition in a high risk area. And in that case, like for recruitment, then you would have to combine, because recruitment, we will see that later, is a high risk area. Then you would have to combine this, because you need to inform the person concerned. And of course, if the system is high risk, it continues to be high risk and therefore needs to be checked. Now we come to this. I already started with the high risk. So you go up the pyramid, you see it on the right-hand side, the yellow one, we are now the high risk part. And here we have 2 big blocks in our regulation. One is the safety components of regulated products. This is all the AI which is embedded in a device. And that can be a medical device, a robot, this can be a drone, a car, whatever. In this area, you normally have already a lot of sectorial specific safety legislation. We will align to this, because we will look at what is already regulated. And if your product is already regulated heavily because it's already subject to a third-party conformity assessment, then we will make the AI as well subject to that anti-conformity third-party assessment. We will not add a second assessment or a second procedure. This should be integrated in the procedure as it stands, because your product has to undergo this process when it wants to be certified and allowed to the market. But there should be, the AI should be properly checked. And there should be clear criteria what should be done with this AI. That's for the sectorial legislation. And then this is in the regulation, if you want to have afterwards a look, This is in Annex 2. And then you have Annex 3 with the self-standing AI or the standalone AI systems. These are the systems for biometric identification or systems which are used for education and training or for migration, asylum, and border control. And here we've identified these 8 categories, which you find in Annex 3 of our regulation, because according to our risk analysis, they are particularly prone to risk. Because here there is, from the experience which you have, from the data which are available, there is a certain likelihood of a damage, and this damage is serious for the individual concerned. That doesn't mean that the whole categories are high risk, but in these categories, there are high-risk uses, and these uses you find in Annex 3. So it's not the whole area, but it's the individual uses in Annex 3. So it's not everything in the administration of justice is high risk. If you have something to keep, to do file keeping, this is not high risk. But if you have like an assistant judge, that may be high risk. And this list of the use cases can be amended over time just via delegated acts, because we did not want to have a huge list just out of fear that at one point there might be a high risk, but we wanted to have really only those items on the list, those use cases on the list, which are already now clearly a high risk and which we can then update over time if need be. Now, I hope I have not yet fully confused you. You may already wonder, what do I now need to do? I'm a developer of an AI, and in case this regulation is adopted by Council and Parliament, what will be then my obligations? How do I then can comply with this regulation? Will it be very complicated? So in the future, you as a developer or a provider of an AI system, you would need to first check, is the software I'm developing, is this AI according to this definition? You look in Annex 1. Is the system I'm developing a high-risk system? You look in Annex 2 and Annex 3. So we have done the assessment for you. If both answers are yes, you are developing a high-risk AI system, then indeed you have to comply with the requirements for high-risk systems under this future regulation. That means first you have to set up a quality management scheme in order to ensure compliance with the regulation. And then you have to do the ex-ante conformity assessment. So you have to have your system checked or check it yourself before it enters the market. And then your system will receive a CE marking to show that your system has been checked and is in conformity with our requirements. If it's a self-standing AI, it will even be registered in a central database. And once you have this label, you can market it. And this label should give you as well some legal protection and should as well be in some kind of advertising, because it will show that your AI is trustworthy and safe as for any other product. So now the logical question would of course be, what do you need to prove in this ex-ante conformity assessment for the high-risk cases? What is then really, what is all this about? And here you find 5 criteria which have already been discussed by the high-level expert group, but which had already as well been shown by us in the white paper in February 2020. And here you have them again. We spelled them out in more detail in the legal text. You have requirements on training and validation and testing of data, which is key. You have requirements on documentation, what you need to document in order to ensure traceability and auditability of the system. You have to ensure an appropriate level of transparency, and you have to provide the user with certain information. You have to ensure a human oversight about the system, and you have to ensure a sufficient level of robustness, accuracy, and cybersecurity. And all this will be what we call in the technical jargon will be essential requirements. And we will try to fill out these essential requirements with industrial standards. And then normally, if you fulfill the industrial standards, if you comply with these standards, which will be published in the official journal, then you should be sure that your AI system should pass the test easily, or you can even do the test by yourself. Now, if you break down all these obligations on the different players, we simplify here a little bit for the sake of making it accessible. We looked a bit who has to do what. And you see then the bulk of the work will have to be done by the provider, because we believe the provider should really make the product safe first, and then the product should freely circulate on the market. And the provider here would have to do a quality management. He has to provide the technical documentation. He has to provide the logging obligations. He has to do the ex-ante conformity assessment, and he has, after all, to register the system in the database. And then he has to put on the CE label on the product, and then the ex-post monitoring. So this is a full life cycle. The user on its side only has basically to follow the instruction of use as for any other product. If you have a car, you have to use it as well according to the instructions, and that should be the same here for the AI. Then the user has to ensure an appropriate human oversight, so that it's respected that the human is at the center of the AI system. He has to monitor potential risks of the use and has to report very serious incidents. This is defined, this is really serious damage, to the provider. And of course, he has to respect other legal obligations under national and EU law. So for the user, it should rather be a safe undertaking than to use this AI. He just has to respect what the provider tells him. Here you see the life cycle of the AI is another way to break this down. You have to design it in line with the requirements. You have to do the ex-ante conformity assessment. You have to do a post-market monitoring. The user has to report certain incidents. And you have to redo the conformity assessment in case you have a substantial modification of the system. Now we come to the top of the pyramid, to the red triangle on the top. And you see the prohibitions, and these are very narrow. We just have 4 prohibitions because we only wanted to really prohibit something which we find outrageously abusive. And you see here what we prohibit is clearly unacceptable. It's a subliminal manipulation where you use AI techniques to, in a subconscious way, to influence users in a way which causes them physical or psychological harm, where you exploit children or other vulnerable person in a way which results as well in physical or psychological harm, where you do general purpose social scoring by public authorities, or where you do remote biometric identification in public spaces in real time. There we have some very narrow exceptions because we think there is a need, but we clearly want to give the signal we don't want to see general mass surveillance in public spaces around the clock. As this was the most controversial point, this real-time remote biometric identification, I want to go to this a little bit more in detail. This is the last prohibition you've seen in the previous slide. You see here we have this prohibition of real-time. The exceptions are if you search for a victim of a crime, if there's a threat to life and physical integrity or terrorism, or if you look for somebody under a European arrest warrant. You always need judicial authorization, and the judge has to check the proportionality, so it cannot be, you must have a reasonable suspicion that the search person is at the given place in time somewhere when you look for him or her and you switch on the system. So it means that you cannot have an indiscriminate mass surveillance. And all this is, of course, these exceptions are only possibilities for the member states, so they need to activate them. The member states need to adopt a law in order to make use of these exceptions. If they don't do it, it will be an unconditional prohibition. All these AI systems, and this is really important on the right-hand side, all these AI systems for biometric identification are high risk. So they all need to undergo quality requirements, which I think is key for us because we believe that a lot of the discussion on this biometric identification is really about having inaccurate systems or systems which do not really function well. Therefore, we put a lot of emphasis here, and we even put additional requirements, namely more extended logging obligations and the 4 eyes principle on top of the usual requirements. You should not forget that all this, of course, happens on the basis of the existing legislation. So you always have to respect the general data protection regulation. And that means, of course, that there as well, you have, for instance, in Article 9, a prohibition of the processing of biometric data. Therefore, you should you can only do it when these exceptions are applicable. You cannot override these rules. We have, and this may be interesting for you, we have, of course, thought a lot about how do we get the balance right between regulation and so ensuring trust and avoiding stifling innovation. And therefore, we tried, in particular for our startups and for our SMEs, to have some support in this regulation. So we developed regulatory sandboxes which member states may introduce, which could provide a safe environment under the supervision of the Data Protection Authority to develop a certain AI system. And there should be support measures for startups and SMEs, for instance, provided by our digital innovation hubs. At the same time, we can have reduced fees for the conformity assessment, and we can have an adaptation of the quality management assessment in case of a startup or an SME, which should as well help to reduce the cost. And what we foresee for the sandboxes is facilitation of a certain data processing, so that you could have better and easier access to the data which you need in order to test and validate your system. Now, how will the administrative system around this look like? The main bulk of the administration will be done by national administration. So the national bodies and authorities will be competent. They have to designate notified bodies who are certified to do the tests. They have to have notifying bodies looking over these notified bodies. They have to have market surveillance authorities doing the ex post control, and there should always be one contact point, a national supervisory authority, working together with the Commission. On the European level, what we will create is a European Artificial Intelligence Board, where all the top representatives of national bodies should be represented, the Commission and the European Data Protection Supervisor, and that should be a forum to give advice to the Commission to update the regulation and to ensure consistency of its application. The Commission may as well reflect on an expert group at a later stage. That's not yet fully been decided, but that's an option where, of course, then the different voices of society should well be represented. I promised you at the beginning, I did not only want to speak about the regulation, but to drop some words as well about the coordinated plan. I know the time is running, therefore I will cut it short, but I think it's important because otherwise the message would be a bit one-sided. We had already in 2018 a coordinated plan where we mainly, that was a key point, asked member states to develop national AI strategies. They've done so to the vast majority. Now we want to update this because we had the COVID pandemic, we had the Green Deal, we have the digital decade. So the circumstances have completely changed. We have a number of technological breakthroughs, and we have new financial instruments because with Horizon Europe, with Digital Europe, and with the Recovery and Resilience Facility, where 20% of the money should go to digital, we have a substantive amount of public investments feasible, which could really be a game changer. And that's what we developed. We have 4 key areas where we want to do support, which should really help to flourish and to boost the AI industry in Europe. That starts by enabling conditions for AI and the uptake in the EU. To share the knowledge means basically to share the digital the AI strategies. To boost the data economy, we have started with the Data Act. We will develop data spaces, foster critical computing capacity. This is in particular the IPCI, but as well the Euro HPC. We will work more with stakeholders, so we will have a new public-private partnership, the centers of excellence, the lighthouse, the testing experimentation facilities, the hubs, which we will create to support as well the implementation of this regulation, and the InvestEU possibilities to provide further funding. We will work on skills. We will work out in the world. That's another important part, because we want to reach out to our partners to achieve their common understanding. And then we have to look in some sectors where we want in particular focus in order to support the uptake of AI. I can come to that later if you wish in the discussion, but I think now I spoke already enough and you're probably exhausted because this was a little avalanche of information, but I was asked to cover it completely and I didn't want to exceed 20 minutes. I hope you're still with me and I'm happy now to take your questions.
Well, thank you so much, Killian. Just have to end the presentation and being here, and of course adding Millie with us. So, Killian, thank you so much for this summary of this regulation. Let us start with the first question. As we from the KI Bundesverband and many of the other national associations have a lot of members who are startups. And you said what the chances could be or what you want to do for startups. But the first reaction I got from some of my members was, oh my God, now we had GDPR, we implemented it, now we have the next level. Can you tell our members where the benefit is for them that the EU is regulating this? I get, by the way, completely, we don't want to be China, we don't want to have social scoring and stuff like that. I get that, but where can they profit from this kind of regulation that you're proposing?
Well, thanks for the question, Daniel. We think if we that's where I should start. Well, if we get it right, if we achieve our purpose, this should be really an internal market act that should help the market to boost. So we have a bit taken, I think, a different approach than a GDPR, because here we look at AI mainly like a product, and we try to make this product system safe. But at the same time, this should allow, with a uniform legal environment, to have a bigger market for AI. So one thing, of course, which is good for startups, should be that you have one legal framework all in Europe. There will not be on top of this, there will not be other legal requirements. You will know if you're a low risk or medium risk category, there is nothing else that you have to do than this will avoid a mushrooming of different legislations which could cover different aspects of this AI. That's perhaps the first thing. The second thing is that we believe, I mean, the last Eurostat survey we have seen said that only 7% of the European undertakings with more than 10 employees use AI. And this is a huge deficit, and we really need to boost this. So on the user side, we have to take away the fears. I think we can create a market and a demand for AI if users feel they are safe if they use AI because it's trustworthy. I may give you an example. If I'm a company and I want to use an AI for my HR, and I want to do the recruitment and the HR management with an AI, which could be a very innovative solution for me. If I'm afraid that I will get legal claims, and if I'm afraid that I will discriminate and I will be exposed to fines and compensation payments, I will think twice about it. And I want first perhaps to employ a lawyer to check if I can do this, if this is safe. If I have an AI which is certified, which has a label and which has been checked, this obligation should normally be on the provider. If this AI has been checked, you can, as a user, you can be sure if you use it according to the instructions, it's fine. It should work. And last but not least, for the developers, when we developed this proposal, we discussed with a lot of them. And if we always go back a little bit and we think about that, we're really speaking about high risk, and we really try to be very restrictive. If you develop a high risk system, you take care of the quality. It's not like a gadget where you do something to play with or to entertain. If you have a system where you basically, for instance, you prepare a judgment in a criminal case, or you have a system where you work on migration applications. This is very serious stuff. And no authority in the world would buy such an AI system if they're not convinced that this is working properly. So I think normally what we believe is that these compliance costs, which we have tried to keep as reasonable as possible, but of course there are compliance costs, I cannot deny this, but normally these compliance costs would probably occur in any case. It's like in a car. I will not have an AI embedded in a car and not test it. I will have the highest quality because otherwise nobody will sit in this partly autonomous car. What we do then, if you look at from this angle, we will uniform this and we will give a common standard what you have to do. And we will not leave you alone with developing your own standard that you think is appropriate, where you have then to persuade your client that this is that you have got it right and the standard you offer is satisfactory. That's a bit our thinking.
All right, and to the point of the common European level, we have our first video question. Before we get to the question in the chat, as Millie just said to me, there are quite a few of them already, which we are very happy. But we start, I think, with our friends from the Netherlands. Yes.
We believe a clear legislation is a necessary step towards human-centric AI. And human-centric AI can become a trusted and highly valued approach by citizens in Europe and a strong proposition by European industry. But the practical value of legislation is dependent on a common and consistent interpretation by all stakeholders and across all member states. We expect quite some discussion on classification of AI applications that may require a learning approach with both authorities and applicants. How is the EC going to facilitate such learning approach and consistency among member states? And how is the EC going to make sure that there is sufficient expertise and capacity to facilitate a swift qualification procedure for AI applications? Already today, there are serious backlogs in handling GDPR cases with authorities in member states, and long lead times will have a significant impact on economic development.
Bedankt to the Netherlands. Killian, what is your opinion on that?
My Dutch is too bad, Daniel, in order to compete with you, so I stick to English. But it's a very good and very pertinent question. Yes, we've seen this, and I cannot deny what you say is fully right. There have been legislation from the EU where the application was not that consistent and caused trouble, and this is of course undesirable. It's undesirable for the companies. and as well for the customers, because the level of protection is then variant, and you have abusive effects, and you have loopholes. All this is very unsatisfactory. So we thought about this. So what we foresee, I mean, I put it on this last slide on this governance scheme. We cannot really prescribe in all detail which authorities in the member states should do the job, because there is subsidiarity and member states have different organizations. And I think we would touch a lot on their internal structures, and they would not perhaps like this too much. But we've given some guidance. So we believe that for the sectorial legislation, so where you have the products, for instance, that probably they will use the bodies which are already there. That makes most sense. So if you have for cars, this is very well established, who checks cars, and these bodies will probably then as well check the AI, and they of course then need to be certified for this. But when we speak to them, they're of course very happy to do that. I think that will not be so difficult. It will be more of a problem in the new areas of the self-standing AI, where this tradition of having a check before you bring your product to the market is new, and you have to develop a scheme. And there you have two choices as a member state. You can go for a sectorial approach, so you can say, okay, this is a tool for recruitment, so I asked my labor agency to have the overview as a competent authority, or I can say, I give it to the DPA, the Data Protection Authority, as a horizontal body, or create a new horizontal body if I wish, and they should do it because then they have the expertise in AI. We spoke a lot. We learned that for the financial sector, there's a strong wish to have this in the financial sector, so that we have foreseen that. As well for law enforcement, they wanted to have it either in the law enforcement area or in the General Data Protection Authority. For the rest, we leave that open, but we will clearly work with member states, because we think, I mean, there are different arguments you can make. But what we have in the regulation is there's an obligation for member states to notify these bodies and to equip them sufficiently with staff and resources, and we would clearly plead against too many different bodies, because I agree with you, it's a technically complex task. And if you have too small bodies, they may not just be up to the task and not up to the speed which you need. Then we have on the European level, we will have a coordination mechanism. That's why we want to have this board. We don't want to have an agency. We don't want to create more bureaucracy than necessary. But we think we need this board in order to exchange, to make sure that we have, after all, a consistent application. We try to put a lot of the assessments in the legislations, why we work with these lists, because we don't want the alternative would have been a system to say to the operator, you assess your risk, we give you a wonderful list of a risk assessment, and then you conclude on a risk level, and according to the risk level you do your assessment. That, in my view, would have sounded very nice on paper, but would have been very difficult in practice, because risk assessments are complex. So we try to do this ourselves, and we will update this, but we need this consistency mechanism. And then we will have, we foresee already 2 years of transitional period. That's another element perhaps I should mention, because we know that it will take time to set up a solid system. So we will only apply the regulation to the systems which are not on the market when these 2 years are over. So all those which are already there will be grandfathered. But within the 2 years, we should have then a solid system of a solid infrastructure of bodies doing the test, and a solid set of standards filling out the substantive criteria. And with this, we hope that we can ensure a decent and equal level of scrutiny.
Yeah, thank you. And now to our first live question. Millie, your mic is muted, so it's unmuted now. What are the first questions from our listeners and people who watch this broadcast?
Well, where to start? I mean, Killian, at the end of your presentation, you said, I hope everyone is still with me, but I was watching all the comments, and I have to say, this is one of the liveliest comment sections I followed in one of these presentations. But let me start with something, sort of a bigger picture. You mentioned in your presentation that the regulation wants to support innovation. And one of the questions we have here is, could you elaborate on that? So in what way does this regulation support innovation?
Well, it's a bit aligned to what I said already. I think this uniform market, no fragmentation, trustworthiness as a sales product. Ideally, it will help that Europe in this area will set the standards globally as well for trustworthy AI, which should then as well help to make the European product rather successful. So these are the things I already mentioned. Then on the practical side of things, we tried to help our startups because we know that a lot of innovation comes from small companies, from innovative companies who are very good and very creative and very needed in order to boost this. That's why we try to use this element of regulatory sandboxes. So there you should be able to go to the sandbox and you should be able to develop your AI system with the support of your data protection supervisory authority, and that should help you to have an easy ride once you come to the ex-ante conformity assessment, and should as well help you to decrease the costs. That I think is the first cornerstone which we will do. And then we have a second cornerstone is we will have an Article 54 further processing of personal data for developing certain AI systems in the public interest in the sandboxes. So we will facilitate, not for all, but certain processing of personal data so that you have enough data. Because what we learned is that very often the real problem is to have access to sufficiently sound data sets. So we will help you with this. And then we have a whole article about measures for small-scale providers and users. You will get priority access to these sandboxes. You get, there should be an awareness training and so on, and there should be a dedicated channel for communication. And here that's why I came to the coordinated plan. We would like to see this a bit together with our general structure, which we want to create. We want to set up these digital innovation hubs, and there should be in every member state one hub for AI. So, and this could as well act as a contact point. So if you are a startup, if you are an SME, and you wonder what to do, your hub, your AI specialized hub should be able to direct you toward the best place to do this. And we will set up as well the testing and experimentation facilities, which should help as well the competent bodies. That links a bit to the previous question. There could as well be facilities where you could do the practical testing. There should be centers of knowledge. So if your competent authorities are not, and notified bodies are not able to do the tests by themselves, they should find the knowledge. So I think there is a bit of, there's an interesting area here. And last but not least, we think that this focus on really good data sets could as well be an element, not the only one, but could be an element in order to create in Europe a certain market for high-level, high-quality data sets, because you will need these data sets for testing, for validation, and for other purposes. So I think there are a number of elements which could be helpful. And last but not least, to close this a little bit, I think in particular for smaller companies, if you have this common label of being trustworthy, it may be easier sometimes to compete with a bigger one. Because if I buy an AI system from a very well-established company, from an incumbent, if you want to use the old telecommunication language, you can probably be sure that this is, at least you don't have a reputational risk. You can say, I bought it from company X and they are well known, so I expect this works. If now we have a label for trustworthiness, as well as startup can have this label, and they will compete on equal footing, because nobody will can seriously claim that the product from another company may be better or maybe more fancy, I don't know, but it will not be more trustworthy. So I think there is an element where you could, so we really focus in the regulation to make the uptake of AI easier. We know that there's a certain, of course, a certain additional hurdle now for the development, because you may have to undergo in certain cases this assessment. We try to make it as clear as possible when you have to do it, so that we avoid, that's another thing which was a lesson learned from the past. We want to avoid a big gray zone where you go for security purposes, you do the assessment because you don't know whether you are high risk or not. So we try to be as simple and as clear as possible in our use cases. But then you should as well be trustworthy, and you should have this marketing argument.
Before we go to the next video question, another question from the audience, Millie?
Which one shall I pick?
Please do.
Okay, here's one. AI is already there in our smartphones with quote unquote riskless objectives. For example, write an email. But they are also built. But they also build personal user models that may be used for other purposes, targeted ads, influence. Furthermore, they are not transparent and controlled by non-EU companies. How can Europe enforce that these AI systems are not used detrimentally for European citizens?
It was a long question. I'm reading it again to be sure that I fully get it.
Basically, the question is, there are already AI models in our smartphones. They suggest how we write emails, and they build user profiles for targeted ads and similar stuff. And these are they are built by companies that are non-EU based. So what can Europe do to enforce that these AI systems are not detrimental to European citizens?
Well, first, as I said, the regulation will only really intervene if these systems are high risk. So a lot of the things which you have on your smartphone with an AI is probably not high risk, and therefore, be it a European developer or a non-European developer, will not make any difference because you can continue to do it. All kind of nice gadgets will not be of risk. But if, in case you have an AI system which constitutes a high risk, and as I said, this is in our view a clear minority, then we tried in Article 2 of the regulation to create a level playing field. So we have a rather wide scope. So we want to apply the regulation for all AI systems which are used or put on the market in the union. Used means here professional use. So if you're a tourist, this is not relevant. When the user is located in the union, and the user here is a professional user, and we mean the person basically mastering and monitoring the system, not only the affected person, or when the provider and user of the AI systems are located in the third country where the output produced by the system is used in the union. This is the idea that we want to avoid circumvention. So if you think I want to have an AI as a recruitment tool, but I don't want to do the test, so I work together with a company in a third country, and I let the data then be operated by the third country operator, and they just send me then the output. That should as well be covered. So if the output is designated for the union market, even if the user and provider are in a third country, we want to cover that. So we clearly thought about the circumvention, because this should clearly not be the idea that we push the AI now to a third country and just the results are used in Europe and the AI and the data processing takes place somewhere else. This is not the intention. So we tried here to be broad. Again, if it is high risk, because often it will not be high risk, and then there should not be any issue. But if it is high risk, if it is professionally used in Europe and is designated to be used in Europe, then you're under the rules. Because otherwise we would have this, I think, very unfortunate tendency that people would think, okay, then let's just put the server outside of Europe, let's do the AI outside of Europe and send the data back and forth and avoid the regulatory framework. And that we wanted clearly to prevent.
Millie?
Okay, one more from me before we go to our other questions, but I'm getting a couple of questions about notified bodies. If you could explain the reasoning behind them and what will their role be?
Well, the notified bodies will have a key role because for the embedded AI, so the AI in products, and for biometrics, we foresee a third-party conformity assessment. So when you do your ex-ante conformity assessment, you have to pass by and somebody has to check. And this is, and there, as I said, we will align this with the normal product legislation. So it will be aligned with the scheme which we have there already in place. And we have already there a number of bodies. So member states have normally what we call notifying bodies. These are the bodies which are the supervisory authorities. And they certify the notified bodies. That can be, for instance, for a car in Germany, the TÜV would be a classical case, but we have this in other countries as well, of course, with different private and public institutions. And these certified bodies are really then the place where the provider would come and would show their AI system, and they would do the check. For the self-standing AI systems, we have for the time being foreseen an internal check, because we think there are two ways to do ex-ante conformity assessment, or even three ways, but two ways we discuss here. One is the third-party conformity assessment. The other one is the self-assessment. So you assess yourself by yourself, and you put on the label afterwards. But of course, you're still scrutinized because there's an ex-post market surveillance. We have a very serious penalty provision in the regulation. So going up to 6% of the annual turnover, or 30 million euros, whatever is lower. So that is, I think, very serious. Do you have a certain risk? Therefore, it's not like you can do it or you can not do it. But we think for the self-standing, as indeed the system still needs to be established, and we have not yet all these notified bodies, we want to have more flexibility. We have foreseen that we may walk from the self-assessment to a third-party conformity assessment over time for certain applications if this doesn't work well. That is a tendency we see as well in product legislation. In some areas, it seems to work better than in others. If we see it doesn't work well, we can go back to the third-party conformity assessment, but we will try in the beginning for the self-standing AI to do it with self-assessment in order as well to keep the costs low and to keep the administration and the bureaucracy low. Because we would like, of course, as well to avoid the situation that there are not enough notified bodies, and then developments may be delayed because people may queue or may have to wait until they get a body which can do the assessment. So that should not happen. So it should be, therefore, we would allow for the self-assessment. So normally, and this ex-ante conformity assessment, as I said, should be part of the overall product assessment. So we don't want to have, like in other areas, a new process. So you will go once with your product, and then your product will be assessed in general, like your robot, and the AI part will as well be assessed, and then you will get the CE label for the whole product, of course.
All right, then let's go to the next video question. As European AI Forum, we are very happy that we have also so many member states from Eastern Europe, from our perspective. And I want to introduce you, Christina Ashkenazi from Bulgaria.
Almost every single technological solution in high-risk domain need to go through objective process of certification or approval before it can reach the markets. Do you investigate that there will be a similar process for AI-based system? If so, what would be the measured criteria? Measuring bias, for example, is not trivial since there are all sorts of aspects in which the system can be biased. Some of these aspects may be explicitly known, but many of them are intrinsic to data development processing and the application domain. Do you think the regulation will also provide more concentrated list of properties to be objectively measured and tested? Thank you.
So, the bias question is one that I can say also from my national association, which is discussed really with strong emotions on that. What is your point, Killian?
The bias is, of course, one of the key questions. The data requirement is one of the key requirements which we have. And there we ask basically for unbiased data sets, or that you at least control the data. And we ask, in addition, for a robustness, accuracy, and cybersecurity of the systems. These are let's say, the two most substantive requirements on this in this area. And we look here at training, validation, and testing data sets, which should be checked. We know, of course, that this is a very important point, and I know that there is a controversy in the literacy that some people say that even a completely unbiased data set may not exist, because all the data sets are basically historical, and historically the world was unfortunately not always a perfect place. Most of the time it was the opposite, and therefore a lot of bias and a lot of discrimination or disadvantages have occurred, and the data may represent this. This is true. Nevertheless, we think that the quality and the quantity and the suitability of the data should be as good as we can. And if you have some certain biases, you may have to take precautionary measures in order to overcome this, or to filter that out, or to take corrective measures. You need them to be aware. So you need to make your system as perfect as possible. And we think here there is even a chance, because this is always, I find it a bit on the contrary. When I go to some conferences and people tell me that AI is so dangerous because you have a recruitment, and then in the future you will always continue, the company will always continue to employ white engineers, because in the past they've always employed white engineers, or even white male engineers. Yeah. But this happens, of course, in the analog world as well. And if we have a good data quality management, then in the future this company will at least get offers and suggestions to take other people, because the system will be alerted to this problem, and the data set will be looked for that problem. And you can, for instance, anonymize certain elements. If you see that this doesn't work, there are different techniques how you can perfectionize this. And I think if we do it well, we could as well understand that AI may even be an opportunity to overcome certain discrimination from the past, because we could be much more sensitive to certain discriminations, and with technological means automatically try to correct certain discriminations which otherwise would just continue, because we should as well not be too over enthusiastic about the analog world, where lots of discrimination happened, and it should not just be like we had a perfect world before we used AI, and now we use AI and the world is going to become evil. I think that is not the message we would like to get across. We think if we look we try to correct biases as much as we can. We take corrective measures. We are alerted to this problem. We can, with these AI systems, even improve selection processes and make them more objective and more fair and more transparent than this has happened in the past. So it can be a step to in that way to a more open society if it's done well. And it would be a bit unfair to discriminate the AI over that it would perpetuate prejudices.
But when we see, for example, and I get completely that it's very difficult of having definitions written down for regulations like this. But for example, Tina is asking a question: why have so many definition problems in this discussion? What differentiates a deep fake from a usual fake? Is it allowed to have a fake done with Photoshop 1.0 and it's not with an AI system? That's the question of Tina.
Yes, if it was easy, we had not thought about it for 1 year. We tried our best, and I want to be honest with you, and this is really cutting edge what we're doing, and we learn every day. And I don't want to appear here like we come from Brussels and we know, at least virtually, and we have all the answers to all potential problems. We learn as well, and this is moving on. We think, of course, this is a pertinent question. And of course, I mean, we all know, if you like history books, that already the Communist Party in Russia has faked photos and has cut out opposition party leader, former party members from this famous photo on the funeral from Mr. Lenin. So fake news and fake photos have a long history. This is not something new. But the difference we have now, and of course, there is a definition, there may be a definition issue. The difference is that now it gets really, for a normal person, undistinguishable. You reach a level and it's so simple and it's so perfect that you can create these fakes that you can really irritate and you can really confuse people and the perception of the people, which was in the past, if you had a whole propaganda machine, probably punctually you could do this, but now you can do this in a massive and in a broad way, which really affects and impacts our society. I mean, you can read these articles about bots which appear and whether they discriminate or put a negative light or shed a negative light on opposition politicians or other politicians, and it's not really, and people still believe what they see. And this is, I think, a fair point, because this is as humans, we work with our senses. We believe normally what we hear and we believe what we see. And if we want to have a digital world which functions a bit like our analog world, there should be true there as well, that we can believe what we see. And if something is constructed in a way that it's intended to make me believe something which doesn't exist, then this is for me a deep fake, and we should indicate this. And normally this should not be a problem. If you have honest intentions, in case of doubt, you just put a little banner somewhere, this has been created by an AI device. This is all. That doesn't do any harm. I don't think that in case of doubt, if you have a definition problem, then I would certainly recommend you put a little banner, because if you have no bad intentions, if you don't want to influence public opinion before a poll, for instance, by discriminating a certain candidate which you don't like or a certain party which you don't like, I think this is important. And I guess we will have much more discussion about this even in the future, because we see now in electoral campaigns, for instance, that it gets more and more aggressive and dirty in this respect. So I think that is the first. Perhaps this is certainly not the end of the debate, but I think it's the first little fence we want to put into this race.
We have our next question from this time a member of the KI Bundesverband here in Germany, and we will listen to Tobias.
Proposal to AI regulation is specific to a group of algorithms. This affects a wide range of existing systems, while it excludes others from anti-discrimination requirements. Wouldn't it fit much better to the purpose to have a technology-independent regulation that gives clear obligations and rights to any automated decision process?
Thank you, Tobias. Yeah, so why regulate AI? Why not doing technology-wide regulation in this sense?
This is, of course, a very good question, and a question which is often discussed in the circles, whether we should not have a law on algorithm, whether we should not go further and say every algorithmic decision-making system should be regulated, or the more moderate variation of this topic would be to say every algorithm should be regulated if it displays certain risk features. So if it's complex or has a certain level of obscurity and leads to certain complexity. So just to make it dependent on the level of complexity. And this was indeed something which we discussed. So we could imagine not to look at AI as this kind of technology, but to look broader and to say every automated decision-making process which leads to a certain level of complexity should be subject to these transparency rules, quality requirements, what we have inserted in this draft regulation. We had long discussions about this, and I think in the end, and I'm happy about this, we decided against this, because if either you regulate everything, then you catch as well a lot of things which really don't need any regulation, because then you have very simple algorithms which are neither obscure nor opaque, just algorithm, and it makes no sense to regulate them. Or you have a very complex assessment that again you leave it to the user to say, when is your system complex? And you find then more or less abstract criteria that you do a self-assessment and you identify now your system is complex or so complex that you need additional criteria. And we had long discussions as well with experts, and beyond illustrations, you don't really get a definition what is then a complex decision-making system, because everybody agrees that there is a lot of decision-making processes which are very straightforward and you don't really need any kind of additional regulation, because this is basics for any informatics. And there may be systems which are so complex, for instance, that you indeed may say, well, this reaches a level of complexity which is very similar to AI, and why then treat that differently than others? But I think that would create a huge uncertainty, because you will not be able to really identify the systems which are very complex. And we think the last thing the market needs is this uncertainty that you put. That looks very nice on paper, very sophisticated. You can have a very elaborated text about risk assessment and complexity assessment, and you can put lots of things in there. But in the end, you would leave the user alone with this assessment, because you would say, okay, now you read it and you tell me what your system is. And if your assessment is different than the assessment of the competent authority with their fines afterwards, you have tough luck. So we thought it's better that we make the effort to identify at least those technologies or those systems, and that's what we've done in Annex 1, where we believe that they are used, they can display these risk features. And that's why we put them under a certain regulation. Perhaps in the future we need to do more. Perhaps in the future we need to extend this Annex 1. I think our definition allows for some room de maneuver if this is needed, but we only really cover then in a clear way those where we can say, what I showed on my first slide, they display these 5 risk features. And we do not put in general all kinds of computer programs under suspicion and put a very complex assessment with this sanction mechanism on top of it on the user, saying, now please do an assessment whether you think or not your system is complex. So that's why we have gone for the user-friendly way, and we have tried to identify these are the technologies where we are convinced, as we stand today, that they can play these risk features. We don't exclude there may be more in the future. We want to be technology neutral. We want to be as open as possible there. That's why we have this wide definition, but we want to be as well clear. That's why we put this in the annex. And if it's not in the annex, you should be safe. You don't need to doubt whether your system is considered from us to be complex or not.
Before we go to the next chat question, I got a direct message because you told us about the European Artificial Intelligence Committee, which could be initiated. The question from Ronja from my home state of Baden-Württemberg is, in your opinion, where does it make sense for the national authorities to continue to have decision-making leeway in the future? So do we want to have a European Commission on Artificial Intelligence, and who gets in, or should we give it to the national states?
I think that the central decision, the individual application and implementation will really be for the member states, and they will then need to make the necessary assessments. I don't want to centralize this, and I don't think that it's the intention. It would be too heavy. And we have a lot of bodies there, and member states can adapt this to their system. So the notified bodies, the competent authorities, all this will be in the member state, and I think 90 or 95% of the implementation of this regulation will be in the member states. What we want to have on European level is we want to have one authority designated by each member state, one of the supervisory authorities, surveillance authorities, which is called the supervisory authority, which is our single contact partner. because it makes sense for us to have a feedback from all 27 member states to hear how the administration of the system works, how the implementation works, where they see strengths and weaknesses for our evaluation and our improvement. So to have a constant kind of feedback mechanism on the functioning of the system. And these people should come together in the AI board. And there will be the commission, there will be the chairs of these 27 AI supervisory authorities, and there will be the European Data Protection Supervisor. And they should sit together and exchange about their experiences. And they should give feedback and advice to the commission. So if they tell us the self-assessment, that doesn't really work for the self-standing AI system in that sector, or this is too burdensome, then we could react. So to keep the system a bit supler, a bit flexible, and to adapt it over time. And as I went through my presentation, I tried to show you that we had foreseen in a number of instances this mechanism of delegated acts, which is an idea that we set in the regulation a framework in which then the Commission may act, of course, with the control of Parliament and Council, because we're not a dictator, but we have a bit of leeway so that we can, in a more subtle way, quicker react to certain developments. And we don't now need to preempt everything and to spell out everything, because we need as well to see how it works. I think that would be a bit audacious if we would start by saying defining all details in this regulation. I think that would not be a good regulation in my view.
Millie, more questions from the comments. I see we have 82 comments or statements there. This is not too bad. Normally happens in other areas of things. So Millie, what is one or two questions from the audience?
Well, here's a very practical question. Could you tell us a little bit about the timeline of the regulation? You know, we all know it's a long process, but when do you expect it to come into effect?
Well, if you ask me, I would like to come into effect tomorrow. But unfortunately, or fortunately, it's up to you after my presentation that you can decide. This will not be the case. No. Joke aside, we will now transmit this to Council and Parliament, and they are the co-legislators. They need to agree on this text. You know, the Commission is always preparing the proposal in the EU system, and then the elected Parliament and the Council, the representation of the Member States, they decide. And then we have limited power, so we are a bit in their hands. We know that there is a lot of interest, because the European Parliament has a special committee on AI. They have set up already, I think, very good reports on AI, on ethics and on liability. So there is a lot of appetite and a lot of sense of urgency in the European Parliament to deal with this file. We see as well in the Council a lot of interest. So I think, and we start already to discuss in the Council, I think we will take up very quickly the negotiations. But as this is something completely new, something completely different, and there are a lot of things which are controversial, and this will not. This is not this fifth update of the railway package, where you have already lots of regulation and you have lots of experience and people know, and that you. This is something where we really tried to do something new and to try to get it right. And I think it will take a bit of time to discuss this and to agree on all the elements. So I would imagine we will have 1.5 years, 2 years of negotiations. If it's quicker, I would be very happy. But as I said, this is not in my hands. This will depend a bit on the political momentum, if there's a clear majority in the Parliament and the Council. And the other thing is whether Parliament and Council will walk in the same direction, whether the Member States and the parliamentarians will think a bit in the same dimension. And then once it's adopted, we will. That is important for us. We will do our best to make this process smooth and quick. So I think it will not be below a year. I think is unrealistic. I think something between 1 and 2 years would be my expectation. Once it is there, then we will have 2 years of transitional period, because we would like really to have a solid system in place before we start to put AI systems under the requirements. So once you have the first AI system in the check, then everything should be there. And there should be enough time to prepare for this.
So let's say it's when we get to, and you never know, of course, how long procedures will take, for example, in Brussels. But let's say we have 2 years, then it's 23 plus transitional year. So the regulation 25, 26-ish, we get that. If I may just also put a point from the chat, if you allow me, Lily, that will you regulate AI finance real trading system that can lead to systemic risks?
Real trade. When you can look.
Yeah, sorry.
I mean, we have, I think, algorithmic trading is already regulated in the financial markets, so that we will not touch. And for the rest, I would then recommend to look in the Annex 3, where we have, I think, a very detailed list what is regulated. That we have so far, we have creditworthiness is one of the cases from the financial markets which we have regulated. But I think it's a bit tricky now. What you see here, the list is exhaustive. So the use cases we have there are the cases which are in for now. There, I wouldn't see that, but I would not like to speculate now about individual cases just with one sentence. I think that would be not really correct. As a lawyer, I would abstain from this. So.
Oh my God. Okay, then we should abstain. But we don't abstain from our next question, this time from Austria.
The categorization of AI systems as prohibited AI on the one side and high-risk AI systems on the other side needs reconsideration. For example, the use of AI systems for predictive policing, for the evaluation of evidence, or in the judicial decision-making process is closely interlinked to potential severe consequences for EU citizens. Also, the use of biometric mass surveillance practices in public spaces are allowed in certain public safety cases. Given the substantial risks, why are these AI practices not considered prohibited AI? How can the use of AI in such sensitive areas be justified?
Thank you so much, Jeanette. Killian.
Yes, this touches as well. You have excellent questions. I have to admit, this touches as well on a very sensitive area, of course, why certain things are prohibited and why certain things are, if you wish, only high risk, if you want to put it like this, even if I don't like this distinction. But okay, we think when we started the construction of these prohibitions, we were rather restricted because this is the toughest word we have. To prohibit something means we take it completely out. We allow not any use. And this goes very, very far. So in cases where we say there may be, under certain conditions, if you do it correctly, there may be some added value, even if a lot of users we don't like. And this is not an exhaustive legislation because other rules still apply. I mean, what I try to say is you still need to apply the GDPR, for instance. So the biometric processing of data is normally prohibited under, or only allowed under certain very narrow exceptions. Or you have anti-commercial practices, or you have the DSA, or you have other regulations which are still there. So we don't govern here the world. What we do is we think that there are specific uses of AI where we really cannot imagine there's any positive use and that we want to prohibit, like social scoring. If you now take the predictive policing, where we have a narrow case in our list of high-risk cases, there we think, yes, if it's done well, and the system must be, of course, there must be, what we first want to do is to make sure that the systems function accurately. So the data are used are fair, are non-biased, and so on. But we cannot deny that in certain circumstances, a member state may want to use this technique because it can bring some benefits. And it can even, as I said before, perhaps even avoid certain discriminations if it's done well. So it would go too far to say we have to deprive everybody from even the opportunity to use this, because this is such an outrageous process to do it, because it may in certain circumstances help. And often these are complex evaluations which you have to make in a society. I mean, the fact that we make something a high risk doesn't mean that we allow it all over Europe. We have a recital there, which is very clear. We say this is just, we make it high risk. It can be prohibited for other reasons. The use can be limited or restricted. It doesn't mean that you, in all member states, in all 27, you can now use these devices when you've done the ex-ante conformity assessment all over the place. There are maybe further restrictions, and member states may decide differently. But if they'll go for use, then these systems should be high risk, and then these systems should really be at the top quality, which we can ensure. That is a bit our message we want to send. It doesn't mean that we think everything which is on the list should be done by everybody all the time. But it's just that we think these things which are on the list may be used, and we have to accept that or we want to accept even that certain member states may think that there are useful cases to use these technologies. But if they want to do it, then they should please do it with the restrictions and with the safeguards we have introduced in our regulation. That's the background for this structure.
I come to directly to the next video question, this time from Croatia, not from your special friend Mislav, Killian, but from Jan. And here
Hello, my name is Jan Stedel from the Croatian AI Association, CroAI, and in the name of our members, I would like to thank you for this opportunity to ask you direct questions in the name of everyone. We as CroAI support the approach of developing AI in accordance with the European value system. We actively participated in the public consultation last year, submitting our opinion on the white paper, and we welcome this newly released draft for AI regulation. In it, necessity of conforming assessment and regulatory bodies on a state level is defined. Our opinion is that this might take significant and very valuable time. We as an association want to organize ourselves and help innovative companies and individuals to go through a certification process with the aim of raising standards and solution development, but also creating the preconditions to start implementing the framework on the Croatian market as soon as possible. We would do so by providing education and sharing of best practices, assistance in preparation of official documentation, peer review evaluation, and even certification. What is the Commission's view on such a proactive approach by a non-governmental entity? And do you see some benefits of creating best practices in this way? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jan. So non-government players, how can they can help and facilitate with you together?
No, I think you can play a vital role because you have the direct contact to the startups, and I know the Croatian AI Association is very, very active, and we are grateful for this because I mean, you know, the Commission is supporting the different associations because I think it's important. You need a voice, you need a network, you need a cluster, and I think you have a direct contact to your members. So to work with them and to train them, to make them aware of possibilities which we as a Commission will offer as one of our support measures, for instance, to make yourself familiar with the requirements, to get in contact with your hubs, to transfer knowledge, and to, for instance, to prepare in a way, for instance, the quality management. That's something you can do, and it may make sense in any case for you to do it to a certain extent if you develop these sophisticated software systems to have a quality management in place and to think about these things already when you develop them. I think your association can be a vital player to transmit this information and to make the members aware and to have a good reach out. Because I think in reality, if you're honest, the problem with regulation arises if you have done the whole development of your AI system somewhere, and then you want to go to the market, and the last minute you realize, oops, I still have to do an ex-ante conformity assessment, but I didn't document my data properly, and I didn't have a quality management system in place when I started my development. Then this is really a hurdle and an extra cost. So this should be smoothly done, and it should be known from the start. And I think their associations can be a really a crucial element to roll out the system and to help everybody to understand what they need to do and how they need to do it.
Thank you, Killian. And last but not least, on our European video tour, which we are doing now, we're going, of course, to France, to Gaël Pinzon from Hub France.
The members of the French AI Association Hub Francia would like to raise two questions. The first refers to the implementation phase of AI. Articles 9 to 15 qualify AI with different terms, such as sufficiently transparent, appropriate, relevant, representative, free of errors and complete, etc. Obviously, these terms may be subject to interpretation. How should they be implemented operationally? Will there be additional guidelines, such as for the model documentation? Will certifying bodies be in charge of establishing this operational criteria? If such, will certifying bodies be local or at the European level with common rules?
And there will be a second question.
The second question refers to the regulatory sandboxes. What will be the process to establish these sandboxes? Is the European Commission working with regulatory bodies to help frame an agenda to establish the sandboxes? Or will member states be in charge of it? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gaël, and hello, bonjour à Paris. And Killian, what are your points about the two questions that came from our French association?
I feel very honored. I feel a bit like in the Grand Prix d'Eurovision that I always get questions.
It is, and I can tell you afterwards you get 12 points or other points, we will see. But
we all have our boards ready and we plan on raising them when you're done. So
I can ask the people in the chat perhaps of giving 1 to 12 points right now, and you will get the score afterwards, Killian.
I'm a bit afraid. You scare me off. No, but you do. It's very nice to have these videos and to show the connection. I mean, we're all Europeans, to show the connection to the different parts. Yeah. I think that's great that you do this, and we are grateful for this. This is very nice, and it brings us a bit of entertainment in the complex discussion. On the quality criteria for data, you're right. What we do is, and what we describe here are essential requirements, which are basically put up a level of quality or a benchmark, but they don't spell out in all detail how this should look like. Why didn't we not go into more detail? This is a bit what we followed is the new legislative framework, which is you don't put the standards into the legal text, but you put the quality benchmarks into the legal text and you fill them out with standards. This is a technique the Commission has used, I think, since the mid-80s in the more modern product legislation, because we realized that if we put very detailed technical standards into legislation, the legislation is normally already outdated once it's adopted fully, because the standards, the technical specifications are modified all the time. So it's better to have quality criteria in the legislation and then ask standardization bodies and to work with them, of course. We do this, we already started, to develop technical standards and then to recognize these standards officially as being compliant with the requirements, so that you can see if you fulfill a technical standard, this standard will make sure, there will be a presumption that you fulfill the technical requirement. So you're right, there needs to be an implementing step, because with these requirements, you will not, as a technical operator, be able to fulfill them outrightly. There's a lot of marge de maneuver. But we will work with standardization bodies, and if the standards are not there when the transitional period is over, we can as well adopt technical specifications as a Commission, implementing acts to give you more details what you need to do, because of course we cannot put in a sanction in such a legal text and you don't know what you need to document. You need the level of detail that you know what kind of documentation on your data is required or not. And what we have now are basically is a level. We describe in abstract terms the level of documentation, but we don't give you the details, and that will follow with these standards. Then your second question on the sandboxes, it will be for the member states. We invite them. We provide these additional facilities here in our regulation, but it will not be the Commission setting up these sandboxes, but the member states get the opportunity to set up these sandboxes. And what we want to do is as well to have then a European system of sandboxes, so that we have then that they work together and they provide a regulatory environment which fits over the union and over the member state concerned. So it says here, it can be established by one or more member states' competent authorities or the European Data Protection Supervisor to provide a controlled environment that facilitates the development, testing, and validation of innovative AI. So that should be the idea. So member states are invited to work together. They should as well be open, of course. They should not be just for national companies, but for other companies as well who want to enter the market. But we want to create the conditions under which member states' competent authorities and data protection supervisory authorities can create these sandboxes. Now you have 1 minute left, and I wonder how you want to go across all the questions.
That is a very good question, but perhaps maybe one more question from the audience, and we won't take too long of your time, Killian, but one last question from the audience would be very good.
I have a question here, which has to do with assessments and verifications of AI systems, which are expected to incur high and additional costs for businesses, and that can be quite a burden, especially for startups and SMEs. How does this help with fostering innovation? And what can we do? And does this really encourage innovation and startups?
Well, I cannot hide that there will be certain costs. We have tried to explain this in detail in the impact assessment. So we have really considered these costs. We have reflected on them. As I said, there are a number of elements which you should take into account. It's limited to high risk. We think that in normal cases, in these scenarios, you would have this kind of quality management and quality controls. We have tried to reduce them as well, in particular for the standalone AI by self-assessment. So you will have then less verification costs. You will only have compliance costs. For others, we have reduced fees for startups for the verification costs. We have some support measures. Yes, but all in all, we can of course not deny, and I want to be frank and straightforward with you, there will be certain costs. We think we try to keep them under control, in particular with a standard that should help them to make it not too burdensome, not too complicated, the compliance costs. And I hope, and we hope, that this will be then outweighed by the additional value of having a trustworthy product, which is a sales argument as well. And the big market, which this can work. Okay.
No, so we are just 1 minute over time, so we are quite good in our 90 minutes time slot. I want to thank, first of all of you who watched this video, and also, of course, not only live, also then recorded. We will keep it online. We thank the audience for all your questions. I thank all the member associations for their questions, but most of all, I want to thank, of course, my co-host Millie for being with us today and checking the questions and asking them. Of all, Killian, thank you so much for taking your time for presenting this. It's really appreciated. I think we're at the beginning of a discussion. This was the first presentation from the European Commission. Then, of course, digesting 100 pages of European regulation is not, how can I say, it's not 50 Shades of Grey in easy reading. And we can, of course, then see how the discussion develops. Killian, we really appreciate your time, and we hope that we can stay in discussion already with our European friends.
Killian, thank you so much. And I would just like to say that we were also joined in our comments section. We saw comments from Mexico and Australia. So thank you to them for joining as well.
Yeah, I saw comments from Serbia, from our friends from AI Serbia. So it is the whole global community there.
No, it was a pleasure to be with you, and thanks for your questions. Thanks you, Daniel, for the organization. Thanks, Millie, and I hope you enjoyed it and I could shed some light on this new project, and I'm sure that we will continue this discussion. So thanks a lot for today.
Thank you, and you already got twice 12 points, so no problem in that. So you're on to the next round, and I wish you a very pleasant day, you all you participated in this. Please stay safe, stay healthy. It is very difficult times, but we try to manage it. Hope to see you soon again, and have a great day. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye. All the best.
Bye.